Okay, it looks like it's 1 o'clock on my end, so
Yeah, I think it's recording at this point then.
okay, I'm going to get started then. All right, welcome everyone. My name's Dan Laird. As Ramin said, I work for CTS. I am an academic project manager, and I'm also a member of the accessibility work group on campus. And I've been a member of the work group since 2017, and I've gone through quite a bit of training sessions on the topic and have taught several breakout courses about captioning and accessibility formatting. So, uh, been doing these workshops for a little while. I did this presentation first at the SUNY Technology Conference in June, and it was received well. And I also did it at the SUNY Wizards conference in November. So, this is part of my tour. So, thanks for joining me. I'm going to put the link to the presentation in the chat. You can follow along there. I think I emailed most of you, so you might have it already. So let me get started. So I find a lot of this work some of the most rewarding stuff I do on campus. And knowing that I'm helping others make their content easier for everyone to use, I really enjoy doing this sort of work. So I'm pretty passionate about it, and it makes me feel good. It's noble work that helps people be more successful in and outside of the classroom. So, with that being said, why accessible presentations? Why make this presentation? I don't know how many on this uh, that are with us today can relate to this emotion. The feeling that I get when I attend a conference, and there are some presentations that are pretty good from an accessibility standpoint, and you could tell some thought was put into them. And I'm all, I'm good for you. You care that's really great. But there's others that are just really like for someone that doesn't have that many check boxes against me. I have bad vision, so I have glasses, but I can hear okay. But there's some things that even I have trouble like seeing if people will use bad color contrast or just use a tiny graph or put a lot of text into a slide and you can't read it. There's just a lot of things that are still going on that I kind of hope that this will help correct. Um, so that's the reason why I wanted to share this with you. So you don't need to be a superhero to make a difference. This is an image I created with Adobe Firefly, which is AI, of a man in a Superman outfit with an accessibility logo instead of the S. Um, a Herculean effort's not required to get makes a difference with accessibility. Everybody has the ability to affect change in their own circles. And in this case, I said to myself, this needs to be addressed. We have many presentations regarding accessibility and inclusion and how to make our web pages compliant and how do we get others to buy in on campus. And that's great. We've had great conversations about those topics and how each campus is addressing those concerns. But it seems, sometimes the message hasn't always been put into practice in regards to documents and presentations that I've seen. So I wanted to give this short presentation that will hopefully touch upon some of the key items to keep in mind when you create an accessible presentation. Some of these might be things that you're just like, Dan, we know we've been told this 1,000 times, enough. And some might be new to you or give you a different perspective that you didn't think about. And a refresher is always good. So, and this is also an AI image I created with Microsoft Copilot of someone consoling someone else on a bench in front of a pond with the birds in the background and the sunset. This is not going to have any finger pointing or call anybody out on their mistakes. We all have to start somewhere. We are not here to shame anyone. We're here to pick up people, support them, and share the knowledge on how to create good presentations. Everyone takes their own journey, and every journey begins with a first step. So I'm here to help you accomplish this goal and give you some of the information and tools you need to provide the most accessible presentation possible. And before I start, this is another image with Copilot of a construction worker laying bricks. Rome wasn't built in a day. I was fortunate enough to do a presentation with my colleague Kate DeForest at SUNY Quad a couple years ago about 1% changes to improve digital accessibility. This was based on the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. You find the low-hanging fruit, start out small, and get those easy victories, and then you build upon them. You learn at a pace that is comfortable for you. Change is hard for many of us, but if you make tiny changes over time in how you create documents and presentations, you'll lose the bad habits and make good ones. And before you know it, it'll become a new good habit, and you'll be doing it without even realizing it. So the first thing that I think is a good thing to keep in mind when you create your presentation, who is this presentation for? So I know some folks get excited when they get to have a chance to make a presentation. They get to play around with a slide deck and, there's like all these great things that you can do in slides and PowerPoint that can make, transitions and, cool pictures and animations. And you get to play around with the software, and it's kind of fun. And you want to make it stand out from the crowd and have a wow factor and not be like everyone else's presentation. But there's something that you need to ask yourself. Is your goal to make a personal art project that makes you happy, or to convey a point and share your knowledge with others? When you boil it down, I believe most people will choose the latter option. And if that's the case, you want as many people as possible to be able to digest the information that you're providing. So you're putting all this work into it. You want to be able to get your point across to as many people as possible in the easiest way. So taking the time to put this all together takes some work, and you want to get the most bang for your buck for the work that you're putting into this. So try to make sure that you create your documents with a focus on your audience and having them being able to read your information and be able to digest it in the most easiest manner possible. So the first thing I'm going to go into is fonts and structures. This is something that's usually the lowest hanging fruit. It's pretty easy for people to grasp, having headings and having readable font and making it easy for everyone to read. That's what it boils down to. Fonts that are easy on the eyes are widely available. So if someone downloads your presentation, they don't have to worry about the font not being available. So you don't want to go out into the internet and be like, well, I want to find something cool that I can put in my presentation, because if you load a font, it might not be something that everybody has on their computer, and that can cause error messages when people open your documents. So make sure it's just something that's easy to use. I think with this presentation that I have, the font is Roboto, and that is something that is seen as a very accessible font and is available in Office applications and in Google apps. So make sure that for the body, as a standard, these are in 24 point that I have in this slide, and I use 40 point for the headings. That's a good baseline for you to keep in mind when you make your presentations. And make sure that you don't use the autofit option, because when you do this, if you start typing more text, it'll get smaller because it's automatically fitting it to the space you're putting it in. So it will change your font size without you doing anything. So you don't want that to happen. You want to be able to fit everything within the boundaries, which is kind of what the second point is with headings and bullets. Make sure that each slide has a unique heading. Each one has to be different and unique to the topic. Use bullets over paragraphs. It's just easier for people to digest information in small chunks rather than, having one block of text on the screen in front of them. Don't go too far down the slide. And this is an example of crowding the margin. And this is something you want to avoid. So what I've done on this slide, don't do that. It's not a competition to see how much you can fit in a slide. It is, you want to have it broken up and look visually pleasing. And sometimes, depending on what room you're in, that might get cut off by the projector screen or, any computer settings you don't know. So your information might get cut off if you start getting a little too close to the margins. So make sure, if you've got a lot of information, just put it into multiple slides. There's no need to put everything in one slide. Is there any questions on this? I think I'm going at okay pace, but feel free to put it in the chat if you want to too. Next thing, color contrast. I've seen this a lot. There's been some presentations where I'll show you an example, but the background was black and the color of the text was like the color of this text in this link. It's like a dark blue, and it's painful to read. It's hard. Like it literally gave me a headache. So make sure that you just keep it simple. I normally just do like this one is this color choice with the font is just black on white. So that, if you just want to keep it simple, that you're guaranteed for people to be able to read it and for it to pass a contrast checker. This is a link to one of those. It's from WebAIM, which is one of the higher authorities in web accessibility. So I'm just going to copy this and put that in the chat for anybody that wants to check it out now. So that will give you what the contrast ratio is with the colors on your screen. So this is that example that I was telling you about. This is the foreground, which is your text, and then the background, which is the background of the page. So you can put those values in. It'll give you like a little eyedropper that you can click on that will do it. So as you can see, that fails. It does not meet the requirements. And I think, let me go back to the other slide. The ratio here is 2.71, and I believe off the top of my head, it's 4.5 passes. So this definitely falls below the range of passing accessibility standards. And as you can see, when you have larger text, it's somewhat easier to see, but it still fails. So, and there's, I don't know if you're all familiar, but there's a WCAG guidelines that we follow, and there's a AAA rating and a AA rating. The AAA is more stringent, and some places try to get there, but AA is a good, baseline to be at as well. So this fails all of them. So something else. So with this is going for the color of my heading. This is actually checking, this is what comes up when I check my text of my heading, which is the green that Oswego uses, and the background, which is white. So this does pass most checks, but it fails the AAA one. So even if you think like you're like, I'm pretty sure like this is fine, and I can read it, so I'm sure everybody else can. Well, even in that case, you're better off checking. It's better just to know and be sure, because even I read this and it seems like it's good to me, but it does fail the more stringent test. And this color is for my heading. So the large text test at the bottom, it does pass that. But if my body text was this color, then it would fail the more stringent test. So it's just better for you to check and be sure. I wanted to show you that, there's ones that are close that you with the naked eye, you're like, I'm I'm pretty sure this is good. That's, it's not always the case. So make sure you check. Any questions on color contrast before I move on to the next topic? There are other, there's web. This one that I shared is on a web page. There are ones you can download um, that I know Rebecca and some of the people in the accessibility committee have brought up. So there are other tools that perform this as well. And something I'm, pretty sure most people know, but I want to bring it up. Creating alt text for images. Make sure that you create a description of each image that you present. That can usually be done by right-clicking on the image in Slides and Office, and I believe both of those have a fairly straightforward menu option that allows you to alter the alt text. Make sure that it's descriptive. You don't have to go, write a story about it, but just make sure that you're descriptive enough so that someone that can't see this image has a good idea of what you put out and the idea you're trying to convey. I've been asked before, you can put captions underneath photos, and that, that's something that does get read by screen readers and can be a valid substitute for alt text. Like if you say, you name the image one, and in the caption it says, in image one there is a construction worker laying bricks at a construction site. That is sort of the equivalent. So you can get around it in that way if you speak to the image in the text. So, and you want to avoid distracting images. A lot of people like to put clip art in their slides, and that's fine if it relates to your text, but it's when when I bring up the slide, and when when somebody has a piece of clip art in their slide, our brains just automatically will go to that first and be like, what's that? What's it conveying? Like, why is it there? Like that's just our brains automatically do that. And what that does, even though it's for, just a second or two, it distracts from the message um, on your slide. So it kind of distracts from the information that you are giving. So if it's something that relates to the information, it's fine. But just think, is it needed? Does it help you get your idea across? And if you want to speak to its meaning, it's fine. But if it's something that's just there, to fill space or to be visually appealing, it's not necessary because it's not helping you get the information across. So readability, making sure that you keep what you're talking about at, I believe it's technically by the standards, I believe it's a fifth grade level. You just want to speak in plain terms. Don't use, you know, large, complicated words that aren't in common vernacular, and avoid jargon. It just helps people read the message the first time through. It helps them, be able to process the information quicker. And it helps those people with cognitive disabilities that might be having trouble reading your text. Um, there's, people that are dyslexic or have a problem with, being able to read at a pace as people that don't. This just helps. And people with high cognitive load, if you're, just having a busy day and you've done a lot and you go to this presentation and you just, if you're kind of burnt out, um, it's just nice to have the ability to read something without having to, tax your brain. So, and if English is not the primary language, that's also something to take in consideration. And try to keep one slide on one topic rather than jumping around. Like I know I said that um, you can use multiple slides for one topic, and that's fine, but just make sure that it's in the same section of your presentation. Like you don't go back and forth between topics throughout. It just keeps people's mind on one track, on one topic at a time, and that's easier for a lot of people to digest. And this is my favorite part, charts and graphs. So this is an actual example of a presentation I went to with a gardener graph that kind of shows the life cycle of, these products. And the first thing that the person said that was presenting said, "I know you can't read this, but," and I'm just like, well, if I can't read it, then why why is it up on the screen? Like, what's the purpose of this? So, if you've got something like this, um, it's best to, if you got a screenshot, try to, zoom in on the part that you want to describe. Like, don't leave it like this, because even people in the front row will have a hard time reading text this small, that bunched together. So try to avoid doing that. This is also another example of, I think it was a vendor presentation that I was watching on Zoom. And even on Zoom, like, if you have something on your computer rather than being in person and seeing something on in the front of a room, sometimes in Zoom you can kind of adjust on your computer and make things bigger to be able to see them correctly. I had a hard time doing it with this. Like, this was kind of their flow chart with one of their security solutions, and it was just like, I can't read this. Like, I don't know why, you have your entire workflow here, especially when they're just going through it and talking about one piece at a time. It's fine, you want to show your entire workflow, but they spent a good 10 minutes with this slide up, and it's like, you gotta think about your audience a little bit before, you do that. So this is something in general, we like to put up graphs of data. It's helpful to see trends and an analysis of that. Some things to consider, like this, the font's small. There's a lot of data in here. Even though there's labels on those lines, from farther away, you probably would have a hard time being like, well, that first one is between 200,000 and 300,000, but how far? Like, I can't really tell if that's like halfway or a quarter way. So, one thing you can do about this issue, you can zoom in, make everything bigger so that you can go through your data in a graph. That's fine. You can use it to get your point across, but kind of split it up. Have it, maybe 2 or 3 slides to go through all that data, making it big enough so people can read, and also using data labels. There's options in the software that will allow you to format your charts so that you can have large data labels that are easy to read. So you see it now, you know exactly what that bar means. So there's no guessing. You don't need to like look at the lines and figure out what it exactly means. It tells you exactly what that data was for that term. So try to, if you've got an image like that, try to chunk it up, try to make it big, and you can, get across the same information using a couple slides. Also, if everybody likes charts, and I understand, but taking the data out and just putting it on a slide like this on a table, like that gets the point across as well. Like, you can see, year or term to term, the changes in the program. So easiest way to do it, it's nice to have visuals, but if you want it to be as accessible as possible, having it in text like this is the best solution. And it's easy. Like, if you're not somebody that's, you don't have to be an expert in Excel to, make charts, but it's, I wouldn't say it's something that a beginner would know. So if you just want to keep it simple, you can just take the data and put it in bullets like this, and you'll get your point across. So that's another option. And make sure, one of the easiest things you can do, and they're great because they go through your document and will show you each thing that should be addressed, are accessibility checkers. Google has one. It's called Grackle. If you go into any of your, let's see, it works in slides, it works in Excel, and it works in Docs. You can go into the help menu, I believe, and there's the extensions, and you can load and Grackle through that, and it will. I think you have to give it permission to look at your files because it needs permission to look at your files in order to be able to do the check, and then you can run it and it will tell you everything that needs to be looked at, and usually will give you suggestions on how to fix it. So they're very helpful. And they also have the Office, the Microsoft Office products. They're very good with accessibility as well. They have accessibility checkers that will do the same thing. So here I have how to get to it in PowerPoint. There's a under the review tab, there's a check accessibility option. So it'll do something similar. So other things to consider when you're creating your slide decks, use descriptive hyperlinks. So you'll have a link that you want to put in your presentation for a website. Make sure that you highlight, write out the text, like say accessibility website, highlight that text, and then you right click on it and you can make it a hyperlink. So by doing that, you're giving the link a title. So it's descriptive. So people know that when they click on that, that's where they're going. So there's, if people put like click here or go to this site, it might be something that's inferred, like where you're going, but a lot, for somebody that's using a screen reader, maybe it's not. So make sure that you use a descriptive link that kind of has the title of the page that you're sending the person to. Like if it's a doc, say, this is the 2024 numbers for this program spreadsheet. So just give it something that lets you know what it is. Promote inclusive language. Sometimes we should be thinking, having gender neutral speaking terms, like not inferring that that slide is a picture of a male, even though you might think that's, what that is. It's better to be general just so that you're describing it in an effective manner. And also saying things like, well, just go to this screen and click here with your mouse. Well, some people don't use mouses, some people don't click, some people use screen readers. So saying click here, click there, like it doesn't really apply to them because that's not what they're doing. So like when I create instructions for a piece of software, I'll say select this option, select that option, because that kind of covers both people using mice and people using the keyboard. So when doing group work, like if say you're doing a presentation in a class and you're gonna take the last half of the class to work on a group project, make sure that the instructions stay on the screen so that everybody has ample time to read them. Because sometimes we'll put up the instructions and then sometimes they'll shut off the overhead or move on to a different slide. So make sure that you keep the instructions up there as long as possible, so that people have time to go back to it or be able to read through it, especially if it's something that's more thorough. And also build in breaks. If you're doing a presentation, I hope you're not, but if you're doing a presentation that's longer than like an hour or even 45 minutes, build in breaks, because we're all human. There's bathroom breaks. There's just the fact that I've been talking about the same thing for 45 minutes. My brain needs a break. Like just that will help people, just recharge, take a second to move away, get up, walk around. And yeah, if you're doing something longer, make sure you build in your breaks. And the place that you are presenting. So if I'm not presenting in a classroom today, but if I was, these are some of the things I would want to think about. Room accessibility. Is this a room that people can get in and out of easily? And is there accessible seating? A lot of classrooms will have a table at the front that doesn't have a chair for people that, are in a wheelchair or some sort of walking thing to be able to, have an easier place to sit. So having that in mind is good. Checking the audio and video before you get there, making sure that everything's working so that everybody can get the best experience from your presentation as possible. Making sure the lighting's good, people can see you, and visibility. Sometimes there's rooms that have pillars in them, and you don't want to stand behind them and part of your audience not be able to see you. That's also a good reason to make sure that you're not. I know a lot of people like walking around and exploring the room while they talk, but some people have a hard time following someone that's moving all over the place. It's easier to have if you got to move, like try to keep it in a small area because that's just easy for people to keep track of you and be able to see you 100% of the time. And Zoom has captioning available, but if you're using something like Google Slides, once you're in this presentation mode, I don't think you can see it if I click on it, but you hover down in the lower corner and there is a menu that allows you to do live captions. So that's something that is also available in PowerPoint. I don't know how to use that option off the top of my head, but if somebody needed to find that out, you can send me an email. I'd be happy to investigate it. But a lot of these products have the ability to do live captioning, and that can be helpful for your audience as well. Okay. And some of the things to keep in mind as a speaker. I know a lot of us don't like using the mic, and I get it. Some people don't like hearing their own voice, but if you want everybody to be able to hear you, if you want to get your point across, if you want to make sure that everyone's comfortable, use the microphone if it's available. Even if it's just a normal classroom and it's available, you should just use it. There'll be people, if you ask the audience if they can hear you, there's still some people that just might be too shy to, or be the one that's the only one that can't hear and single themselves out. So it's just something that takes care of a lot of those issues, and everybody can hear. So, and plus a lot of times if there's a product like that captioning I just spoke about, it has to have a microphone available for it to be able to caption. So keep that in mind. If you have images, verbally describe them. That helps people that might not be able to see the image as well, or people that are using a screen reader and might be viewing your presentation after the fact. Sharing your slide deck, I put the QR code at the beginning and the end of my slide deck so that people that are joining me before the presentation starts, they can, bring up their phone if they want to. I also share it through email with the people that registered for this course. So just sharing it as many ways as possible is good. Because if there's people that, it's easier for them to have the slide deck in front of them and follow along while you're speaking, that might be a better way for them to learn. So share the slide deck, speak slower than you think you should. I just make sure, you're not trying to race through your slides, and it's better if you slow down and make sure that you get your point across rather than make sure that you get into your allotted time. If you have time, rehearse and try to get what you need in the right time constraint. But even if you're afraid of not getting through all your content, it's better if you slow down so that people can understand what you can get through. So I talked about staying in one place, and inclusive language and behavior. Try to avoid using terms like "as you can see here on the screen," because like I said before, saying just use, mouse over this and click this, like that's something maybe you can't see what's on the screen. So when I say "as you can see," that might not include part of your audience. So you kind of want to shy away from that. And Also, make sure that when you're requesting a response from the audience, repeat the question to ensure that the audience understands what was asked. Because sometimes, your audience might not hear what somebody said, and it's also good for the recording. So the people that might not hear that person in the crowd ask you a question will have some context, because if you just start talking and answering that question, they're not completely sure what they asked you. So it's good to have that context of the question and the answer. So, and this is accessible presentation checklist that goes over the slide deck, the room, and the presenter. Kind of most of what I went over. There's a few other things. I'm going to put this in the chat as well. This was created by one of our work group members, and I was able to use it to craft a lot of what I'd put in this presentation. So this is quite helpful above and beyond just the slide deck. And that is all I had. Does anyone have any questions on what we went over? I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, please unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Dan. Thank you. I
Yeah.
do have one question. So when you go to check your slides through an accessibility tool,
Yes.
there is the order. It checks the order.
Yes.
I don't really understand that so much, what that means.
Are you talking about the titles of the slides being different?
No, how things are presented on the slide, so how a screen reader would read it.
I guess if you have a template that's pretty standard, like it will have the correct order on it. But I know if you start messing around with the text boxes, that can sometimes change the reading order. So, and I know, sometimes there's different layouts that have the left side will be a column with text and the right side will be a column where you can put an image. And normally it will treat that correctly. But if you start messing around with them, sometimes it'll throw up an error like that. I don't get that one too much. So I don't, that's my educated guess. So I can look into it for you, but that's what I would
So the
assume.
best thing is to pick your layout and work within the constraints of the layout.
Yes. Like creating a layout and a template, this template is something that I shared with our entire department, that I had some people from the accessibility workroom check through and with me, just to make sure the text and everything was good. So having an accessible template eliminates so many problems. So I that's something that I think as a campus we should probably have something available that is an accessible template that everybody can use. But I don't think we're quite there yet. But we do have a committee. There's a subcommittee from the work group that's working on a high level view, getting presentations that we have to a lot of other people, like student orientation and new faculty orientation, like getting those presentations that a lot of people see, making sure those are accessible. So we're starting to do that sort of thing. So hopefully that's something that will be addressed. So it's on the radar.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? You don't have anything now, you can feel free to email me.
I think that's it, Dan. I don't see anybody asking any questions.
I guess I did a good job then.
Yeah, fantastic job.
Okay.
We'll be starting the next session for this room anyways, right on top of the hour. So there is one more message. Let me see what that one is, or a few more. Just some thank yous
Yes, no problem. Yeah, if anybody has, feel free to reach out to us. We're always working on this stuff and trying to make it better. So questions like Kathy's make it better by pointing out things that I don't already know. So thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us. And like I said, we'll be starting the next session on top of the hour.
All right, thanks for me.
I'm just gonna go ahead and stop recording so we could save the recording.